Welcome to another episode of Commending and Contending. It's a podcast about how the gospel of Jesus encourages us to live our lives and use our words to commend and contend for Jesus and his gospel. I'm your host, Jonathan Holt. Joining me today is Gary Millar. G'day, Gary.
Hi, Jonathan. Great to see you.
Now, Gary, you've been involved with the Gospel Coalition Australia pretty much since it kicked off about a decade ago. What is it about kind of being part of the Gospel Coalition Australia over that length of time that you've enjoyed? What do you get out of it?
Oh, two things. One's quite personal, that getting to know, meeting with, kind of listening to, encouraging a bunch of other kind of gospel workers in all kinds of contexts across the nation. That's been a delight. I think we've often said from the beginning that for most of us, it's the only organization that we've ever been part of that if it folded, we would still actually want to meet together as a group of people who are involved. And that group has changed and grown, over the years, but that's been a persistent encouragement. But really the big thing for me is actually seeing gospel ministry flourish on the ground in our context here in Queensland in ways that I don't think it would have otherwise. For example, last year there's a church plant launched in Brisbane that wasn't under the umbrella of TGC or anything, but was the fruit of just real kind of suburb to suburb gospel relationships and those relationships flourishing, and then people starting to talk about where the gospel need in the city was, and then going, okay, you know what? We need to plant this church together. So it's things like that. It's for us seeing a men's convention reestablished and seeing 700 and something men at the men's convention. But it's also just no longer having conversations with pastors around the traps where I say, "Oh, have you met so and so who's three suburbs away who is doing exactly what you're doing?" But that network of relationships has grown. And so, of course, we always want to see more. We want to see more new churches, want to see more churches flourishing. But I think, certainly from where I sit, here in Brisbane, in southeast Queensland, there are real evidence of kind of green shoots of gospel growth that have just flowed out of like-minded brothers and sisters working together as we contend for the gospel. So for me, that's always been what TGC has been about. Everything, the website, conferences, conversations, they all flow into that, which is seeing the work of the gospel flourish. And I think we've much to give thanks for that.
And Gary, how has God been encouraging you recently?
I think I think God over the last probably over the last 18 months, but specifically over the last couple of months, I think one of the struggles in my life is remembering that I'm not actually God, and that apparently the work of the kingdom doesn't need me to fix everything. And I think over the last couple of months in particular, I just noticed that when things go wrong, that when there are disappointments and challenges, that I think, things like Philippians 4, the idea of the peace of God actually guarding my heart, that has become more of a reality to me as I think I come to terms in new ways of the fact that I am actually finite. And I think part of that is, I mean, I think getting older doesn't guarantee we grow in this, but it kind of is a help. And starting to think, okay, I'm now, I'm 58. I do actually have to think sensibly, about the next kind of phase of life, that it's not just something that I could say, oh, in the normal course of events, I'll think about that in another 30 years, you know. So I think just very thankful to God that I think living with a constant awareness of his sovereignty and his peace has taken perhaps a little bit of the freneticness out of my relationship with him. So thankful for that, praying that will continue.
One of the new ventures that the Gospel Coalition Australia is putting together just now, finishing touches on a preaching workshop online. And a couple of episodes ago, I talked to our Chief Operating Officer, Sarah Kuzwati, about some of the details of that. If people want to go and have a look at the website, you'll be able to see that. We're going to record it. Gary, you're one of the people who are going to present on preparation for preaching, and you're particularly going to take us in your week of the workshop into preparation for preaching on the Old Testament. It got me thinking, though, there are some times where when we go to open our Bibles to read God's Word, whether you're calling it a quiet time or you're making time to be in the Word, we do lean towards the New Testament, maybe because it's easier, it's more familiar, it feels just a touch more relatable. We recognize most of the characters, or we're a little bit familiar with some of what we're going to read, and we feel like we're coming back to it again. I'm wondering about those bold and daring Christians who open their Old Testaments for a bit of quiet time, personal Bible reading, and stumble into something like the back end of Micah or the visions of Daniel or deep into the narrative of Chronicles, and they are just bewildered by what they find and unsure what they're supposed to do with it. It's one thing to read Philippians and think, yes, the peace of God will guard my mind. But what happens when Jehoshaphat goes out and kills all the enemies of God's people? What do I do with that? How do I come to my Old Testament Bible reading with some kind of framework or questions that will help me get something out of it, what God wants me to get out of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, to give you some background to my answer, that's really what I was asking when I finished theological college. I, I spent 3 years and I was still going, I have no idea what to do with this when it
Mm,
comes to preaching. Now, for reasons that I almost can't quite recall clearly, I decided that doing a PhD would help me with that. Would help me with that. Now, in the providence of God, it did, but in a slightly strange way. I have a vivid memory of sitting in my room in Oxford, hitting print on my PhD thesis, watching it kind of spew out of the machine. And I had this terribly dispiriting thought as I looked at it. I thought, you know what? There's nothing in that any Christian who'd had the chance to spend 3 years reading and thinking about Deuteronomy wouldn't be blindingly obvious to them. And for about 60 seconds, I was deeply depressed. I thought, all my all my hopes of, academic stardom and, changing the course of the future of Old Testament study, were coming out of the printer in front of me. And then I actually remember starting to laugh and thinking, hang on, you idiot, that's exactly the way it should be. That if this really is God's word and it's given to his people, that we should be able to read it and make sense of it.
yeah.
Now, I think that's the first hurdle that we have to get over. I think it's all very well for us to talk about the clarity of the Bible, as you said, when we're reading Philippians. But I think for all kinds of reasons, even those of us who've been around church for ages, we don't actually believe that about the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That for various reasons we think we need a professional to interpret this for us. It's not clear. People back then were really strange, so I'm not going to be able to fathom this. And I think what we need to do, those of us in leadership and ministry, one of the things we need to do is kind of debunk that myth and make it clear that the main things are the main things and the plain things are the plain things. And I often think, that sort of if you're watching, I mean, watching TV is a very complex business. These days, as you don't really switch. We don't just switch between channels, but we're switching between streaming services or whatever. But as human beings, we have the ability, especially when we're dealing with stories, to pick up very quickly the basic vibe of what's going on. And we jump around. Now, the problem is when we come to the Old Testament, we kind of lost that ability. We think, oh, I don't know what this is, so therefore I'm lost. But I think, particularly with narrative, which is probably the easiest part of the Old Testament, the most familiar kind of genre, if you like, we actually just need to read what it says carefully and then trust our instincts. I don't, we can overplay that, but there's a sense in which I think sometimes, it's partly because the Bible is printed and if you're using a paperback, it's printed on thin paper and double columns and it's just alien. But if something looks and sounds weird in the Bible, it's probably weird. You know,
Right.
the writer thinks it's weird and is telling us about it, expecting us to go, that's really odd.
Yeah.
Like in those, a lot of the stuff in the early chapters of Genesis, you get to incidents like, you know, Judah and Tamar, or the bit where the sons of Jacob go in and basically butcher a city because Dinah, their sisters, in this odd marriage arrangement. We read it and feel that's horrible, and then go, "Oh, I shouldn't feel that's horrible because it's in the Bible." But
Okay.
it's there because it's horrible. We're supposed to recoil,
We're meant to be
wince at
horrified by it.
it.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So that's actually okay. That's what it's supposed to do. So, I think learning to read and read carefully. Um, and often I say, I teach Old Testament introduction at college, and there's a sense in which the first thing we have to do is get people to start reading what it
Mm.
actually says. So sometimes, like, I encourage people to read with a pen in their hand, or if they want to mark their Bible, write in a notebook. That seems really odd. Oh, it's happened again. And one of the beautiful things about the Old Testament, I think, is that when something's important, it's very rarely said just once. That um, if you keep reading, then you'll see, oh, hang on, yeah, they've shone a light on that again. It reminds me a little bit like when I think our eldest daughter was young, and she was watching TV, in that kind of 8, 9, 10, and starting to watch kind of a bit more developed adult stuff. And the program would start, and she would go, "Oh, who's that? What's he doing? Why is he getting into that car? Why is that car red?" And that was in the first 15 seconds. Now, the answer to all those questions was, "I don't know. Just keep watching." And in any story, we learn to discriminate between the details that are just color, that are just the way things are. They're just describing the setting. And any good story will then start to focus our attention on particular individuals or particular actions. But I think often when we read the Old Testament, we don't have the confidence to keep reading because I think sometimes we think the whole of the Old Testament is like Romans. That so in it every sentence is weird and every paragraph carries the same level of theological weight. Whereas often I think in the Old Testament we need to read it enough that we realize, okay, there are 9 chapters of names at the beginning of First Chronicles.
Yep.
We don't know who 95% of these people are. That's not the point. The point is that these names wash over us as we go from generation to generation to generation. And I think that's where sometimes, reading is both an art and a science.
Mm.
And sometimes we have to learn, those of us with kind of more scientific or mechanical kind of sensibilities find it hard to kind of step back and go, oh, essentially that's painting a 9 chapter picture, with a gazillion Hebrew names. And that if you've got the fact that God is building his people and that every individual matters and that the big issue throughout the generations is sin, you've got a fair bit of what's going on in First Chronicles. But I think we just go, I have no idea what's going on here.
So, in a way, it's kind of like the difference between standing up close to a painting and seeing lots of little brush strokes and being wondering what all this detail of all this yellow brush strokes are. And then you take 2 or 3 steps backwards and you realize it's the haystacks painting, and it's
Yes.
beautiful
Yeah.
seeing it a
Yeah.
little bit further away.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny. I mean, I think sometimes I think about the contrast between, my experience of watching cricket and going to the ballet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'll take a day at the cricket over almost anything. I want to sit where I can see what the ball's doing. You know, I know every fielding position. I'm watching the bowler's hand position, like every nuance. It's like I'm
Mm,
happy in my happy spot. On the rare occasion when I've gone to the ballet with Fiona, I've really tried. I just don't get it. I'm impressed that they can stand on their toes,
mm.
for long periods, but it's almost like I just feel like I do I'm I can see this is impressive, but I almost feel like I don't have the equipment.
Mm.
I don't have the equipment to appreciate the beauty of what's going on, you know? And
And
I think often that's how we feel when we go to the Old Testament, or you feel like, someone dropped in the middle of a test match, when they don't know when they're American, or they don't know the first thing about cricket. But I think what we can do, in both contexts, like if someone sits beside you at a cricket match, you may not be able to get them to the point where they know the difference between, a doosra and a flipper or something, but pretty quickly they get the idea, that someone chucks a ball and someone hits it and the others try to catch it, and. But we can make that orientation quickly, and similarly at the ballet. I know you're not supposed to talk during the ballet, but if you read the program notes, you do got to go, oh, well, they're not just sort of dancing about without any, this is telling a story. And I may not appreciate the finer points, but you get the mood of the music and so on. And I think sometimes that's what we just need to help people to orient them to kind of what's going on here and how warn them how they're supposed to react. So I mean, to give you an example, Jeremiah, the opening chapters of Jeremiah, um, in the first six chapters of Jeremiah, I suspect most people get lost in Jeremiah because they try to work out how every little section relates to the one next to it.
yeah.
And I'm not sure they do relate. Jeremiah is giving us a blast of selections of his preaching over the previous, 30 years. And it's just like bang, 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 bang. I think we're supposed to feel overwhelmed by the end of it. And I think most of us do. You read the first two chapters and we're pretty overwhelmed already. And it's as if Jeremiah goes, "You're not overwhelmed enough. Let's keep going." But we get bogged down in the detail. So I think it's a sense in which learning how quickly or slowly to read different parts of the Old Testament is crucial. Getting to the point where we're familiar enough that we go, this bit feels pretty important. There's a lot of emphasis here, and we may not even be able to articulate why, but we kind of know the difference. I think we do that when we listen to preaching. Generally, the preacher slows down at the bits that really matter or gets louder or what. And then there are the bits in between. And it may be a story or just kind of connection. And I'm not saying that everyone in church can describe exactly what's going on, technically, if you like.
Yeah.
But as we listen, we go, yeah, okay, this bit clearly matters. And I think it's just having the confidence to read the text and allow that to emerge. Yeah.
And it sounds like one way that we do that, you're saying, is by just carefully, slowly, but reading it and rereading it and getting
Yeah.
used to what it's like to read that kind of thing, become more and more familiar, like sitting through multiple ballets or multiple cricket games or whatever it is. You come
Yeah.
back to it over and over again.
Yeah.
But it also sounded to me like you were saying it can help to have a good friend sitting next to you, pointing out things that you might not otherwise see. And you had a recommendation for us about a good resource that we might go and grab? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think especially if you're going to take, a little bit of time, say a couple of months to work through, especially one of the longer books in the Old Testament, or even a
Right.
week or so to read through one of the shorter ones. Um, there's I think a little known resource that deserves to be much better known on the Gospel Coalition America website in their resources section. They actually have a free commentary on every book of the Bible
Okay.
online.
Yeah.
And they're not that they're a bit longer than what you get in a study Bible, for example, which can be
Uh-huh.
really useful, a good place to start. They're a bit longer than that, but they're certainly much shorter and much more easy to read than most commentaries. There's enough there that it'll give you specific help, answer some specific questions if you're reading a couple of paragraphs or a chapter of an Old Testament book. It'll maybe take you 4 or 5 minutes to read the section, so it's not like, you need to have a 90-minute quiet time before you go to sleep or when you get up in the morning. But I find that a really good sort of first stop that will it's just like, reading the Bible in the company of a friend who's a few steps ahead of us, who'll just say, it might help to know that.
Yeah,
I
that sounds like a really helpful person to have
Yeah,
sitting next to you, a Christian friend who knows just a little bit more,
yeah,
and can point out the stuff that maybe if you're looking out for it, next time you come around and read it, that'll help you notice the thing that's being said.
yeah, yeah.
Thanks so much for chatting with us today, Gary. This has been really helpful.
It's always a delight to talk, Jonathan, and hope it'll be useful to people who listen in on our conversations. So.